talking about Chapter 2 in coercion and its fallout. So Chapter 2 is called Not All Control is Coercive. So we're first going to talk about behavioral control. And I want to start by saying most people take control and coercion to mean the same thing. They may not mean the same thing. We're going to get more into that. So, behavioral control, there's a lot of debate in the general public that behavior analysts or behavior analysis is all about punishment. And that is not the case if you're actually involved in the field. You have a better understanding that we actually don't use punishment. In everything we do, our first go-to is positive reinforcement. So behavior analysts see control as a fact of nature that needs to be investigated and described in further detail to help the general public understand it a little bit better. But because they see us as advocates of control, they also think we're for coercion. So we want to teach them the difference. So the control of conduct is physical or social. So it has to do with your physical environment or your social environment, and it is built into the world. So therefore, behavioral control is a matter of fact. It might be scary, and that's okay. It's justified. A lot of people are afraid of control, so why would you not be afraid of behavioral control? We're so used to being coerced that sometimes it's hard to think about examples because you're just so used to it at this point. But like nature coerces us, our government coerces us, teachers, parents, families, friends, everyone. We're just so used to it at this point that it's actually really scary. It's really hard to think about. But for those in the general public, it's really important to explain to them that control or behavioral control would exist even if we weren't talking about it. We're here talking about it so people have a better understanding about it, but it would still exist whether we want to talk about it or not. There are things in the natural world that are controlled that aren't coercion that we actually don't control. So like the book used the example of outer space. So objects in outer space move in a certain way, and it's far from under our control, but it's still controlled, just not by us. So coercion is a subcategory of control. And we can define coercion objectively and identify it in practical situations, and we want to do things to eliminate that coercion. So the world reacts to what it sees and what it hears. It does not react to our thoughts and feelings. The world can't see how we feel or our thoughts, but the way we behave because of that is how the world reacts. So therefore, the control, it's hard to say that it's controlled by our thoughts and feelings, because the world can't actually see that. So what we do might be controlled by the consequences that happen based on our behaviors, and the behaviors are because of our thoughts and feelings. It does get a little tricky. But we are trying, as behavior analysts, we are trying to find out what makes us behave more or less often, and behavioral control is going to help us get there. So we want to discover things that are observable and measurable and we want to use that to either increase or decrease our behavior. What is going to make us engage in this more, and what is going to make us engage in this less? So like I talked about the consequences, so consequences are what follows our behavior. And our behavior is controlled by those consequences. So consequences controlled behavior is we engage in certain behaviors based on consequences that we have encountered or we know other people have encountered. So we're not going to do things based on consequences that we don't like. Therefore, it's decreasing our behavior. And then if we like the consequence, maybe we're going to engage in that behavior more, and our behavior therefore is going to increase. And sometimes we're not aware of the consequences of our behavior, but it's still our responsibility because we're the ones engaging in the behavior itself. Although behavior contingencies are far often coercive, they don't have to be. So the next part of this is what is coercion. But first we're going to talk about reinforcers. And reinforcers are something that increase our behavior. And just because you think you have a reinforcer doesn't mean you actually do. The only way to know for sure if you have a reinforcer is by applying it and getting that increase in behavior that you're looking for. If you're implementing a reinforcer and the behavior isn't increasing, then that's actually not a reinforcer. Just because they like the item doesn't mean it's going to increase their behavior. And because it doesn't increase their behavior, it's not a reinforcer. So like smile and praise and approval, they might like that, but it may not be a reinforcer because it's not increasing the behavior. But we also have to be careful about when we're applying those reinforcers, because if we're applying them at the wrong time, whether it's too early or too late, we could be reinforcing something completely different, and that could be why our behavior is not increasing or decreasing. That reinforcer could work as a reinforcer if it was being applied to the right behavior. So we have to be careful about that. And so there are two major categories of control, and one is negative reinforcement and one is punishment. Positive reinforcement is not associated with coercion because we are adding something to get an increase in behavior. So it can't really closely be related to coercion, because coercion is talking about decreasing a behavior. You're coercing someone to get out of something or to escape something, and it's one kind of punisher has a terminating or getting rid of something that would be a positive reinforcer if we could produce it. The other kind has us producing what would be a negative reinforcer if we could get out of it. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I had something highlighted, but so whether it be a positive or negative reinforcer or a positive or negative punisher, it's still following a behavior, so it's still a consequence. And they're saying that the opposite of positive reinforcement is negative reinforcement. So in the example that they gave here in the book about the dog, so you're trying to teach your dog to sit. When you say sit, if the dog sits, you give them a treat or an edible, and that's positive reinforcement. Dogs are more apt for positive reinforcement because they're hungry animals. They'll be more likely to sit on command knowing that they're getting something that's satisfying to them or a reinforcer. But think that if you were to say sit and the dog jumps on you, we dump the food into the garbage can. And so the food originally is a positive reinforcer, but the removal of it, you throwing it into the trash, is a punishment. And if the punisher has its desirable effect, then the dog is going to be less likely to jump on you in the future when you ask it to sit down. It is the positive reinforcement contingency. The dog gets the food when they're sitting. But you've then coerced the animal into not jumping because you punish them by not giving them the food. And so that they've been coerced to sit down because you've shown them, if you don't do this, I'm going to throw your treats in the trash. So they're now being coerced to sit based on the punisher that you have just given them instead of not giving them the positive reinforcer. So that could have been changed simply by not giving the dog the treat until he sat down. They didn't have to throw the treats in the trash, and now there's no more, even if the dog does sit. You simply could have waited until the dog sat down, and as soon as the dog sat down, they could have received that positive reinforcer. So the dog, again, has been coerced to sit down because the punisher was placed where their treats were thrown away and they couldn't access them anymore. So my question for you guys is based on a part of the book. One of the last pages, it says, control through positive reinforcement then is not coercive. Control through negative reinforcement and punishment is. So they're saying that positive reinforcement is not coercive, but negative reinforcement and punishment is coercive. I would like you to tell me if you agree or disagree with that, based on experience and reading the book, and why you agree or disagree. Provide at least one example to help back up why you think positive reinforcement is not coercive and negative reinforcement and punishment is, or vice versa.